I wanted to talk a little today about balloon-based energy delivery.
When you think balloons and catheters and extrusions that are kind of thin, and then you think energy delivery, it's oil and water a little bit in my mind. You know what I mean?
Adding sensors to balloons, adding cameras to balloons, and things like that. You're going to see more and more devices mounted to the body of balloons.
It really is next level, like the innovation that they're doing in this space. It seems like it's moving really quickly.
It really is a hot.
Yeah.
You can see that electrode or the metal. That's a really cool technology and collaboration between two organizations.
This is enabling you to get places you couldn't get before, right?
He said neurovascular is where cardiovascular was 20 years ago.
Hey everyone, Spencer Jones here, host of the XO Medtech Innovation Podcast. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. I am super excited to have Steve Maxson on with us. Steve leads innovation and business development for US Extruders. He's also the owner of Maxson Insight Services. He's the host of the MedX podcast and the Medtech Unboxed podcast. If you haven't checked that out, you absolutely have to. It's kind of a super unique, super fun podcast, especially if you're into extrusion, into med device innovation. But Steve's background combines disciplines from the fields of extrusion, technology, medical device manufacturing, 20 years of industry experience. Steve leverages this network to assist contract manufacturers and med device OEMs with extrusion, secondary processing equipment, medical extrusions, catheter development, manufacturing services. He really is kind of a wealth of knowledge on all things med device manufacturing, specifically in that extrusion space. And we are just so lucky to have him on. Steve, thank you for coming on and welcome to the pod.
Thanks for the invite, Spencer. We're looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. So just to get it started, you've been in contract manufacturing and the extrusion business for a very long time. Are there any significant technological advancements in medical extrusion that you've seen over the recent years that are really reshaping how things are done?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I wanted to talk a little today about balloon-based energy delivery, which is something that I'm really interested in because there's a lot of collaboration and innovation going on in that area that's creating tremendous opportunities.
Yeah, that honestly, balloon-based energy delivery sounds kind of wild to me, just in the sense like when you think balloons and catheters and extrusions that are kind of thin, and then you think energy delivery, those are like things that it's oil and water a little bit in my mind. You know what I mean? Those don't quite mix. But if you could give us, kind of more detail, on balloon-based energy delivery devices, kind of what that is, what that means, just for people in the audience may not have the level of detail that you have on this.
Yeah, so I put together a little slide deck because I'm a visual person, and
same.
I can do a little bit better job at that. So like I said, I think most of the people in medtech are familiar with balloons and angioplasty, but let's talk a little bit about specialty balloons in the area of energy delivery. And I think the biggest market there that people might be familiar with is electrophysiology, right? The treatment AFib. And there's a couple different modalities that I wanted to discuss, and these are related to delivery of energy. In electrophysiology and ablation, kind of the past technology is more like point-to-point technology that wasn't necessarily repeatable from one surgeon to another. So the industry has really gone to a balloon-based solution because of a couple of reasons. The uniform delivery of energy as the balloon is inflated, we have a uniform delivery, and also the repeatability from one interventional cardiologist to the next. It's an easier process. So again, this is the biggest market, ablation catheters for electrophysiology to treat AFib. And in that modality, we have hot and cold. And on the left, you see a hot balloon, for instance, and that's a balloon delivery system from Biosense Webster. You can see there's multiple electrodes mounted to the body of the balloon. It's pretty cool just to look at that, right? When we're familiar with a traditional angioplasty balloon.
It is. So, I mean, are they, kind of layering that in and then reflowing over it to kind of give it, I'm just curious how they're getting it, in essence, is it embedded or is it laying on top of one surface, that exterior surface?
I don't know exactly. That's IP that they have.
Right.
But to me, it looks like it's, mounted mechanically. It's not a thermal type bond, although it could be incorrect there. I'm not sure. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that at, different methods to mount these electrodes or electronics onto the balloon surface. I'll talk a little bit about that. The other option or modality in ablation, which is kind of a hot one right now, is cryoablation or a cryo balloon to deliver cryothermal energy to ablate soft tissue. And you can see another example there. These are typically semi-compliant or compliant, so highly elastomeric soft balloons, not your non-compliant type PET that you'd see in angioplasty or even semi-compliant. They're typically semi-compliant to compliant, very soft and elastic. Another hot area is PFA, pulse field ablation. You can see the balloon here from the Abbott Volt that has a balloon in a basket design. You can see the electrodes on the outside of the balloon. As the balloon is inflated, you can imagine there'd be uniform delivery of energy through those electrodes via the balloon. It's a hot field.
I feel like I love the hot field. It's just cheeky a little bit. I feel like, I follow, obviously, like most people do, like a lot of these newsletters and digests and things like that. And I feel like every other day I see, either a study or a clearance or somebody getting acquired or picked up or a company raising a lot of money in the pulse field ablation space or cryoablation space, or like go down the list, all of the stuff that we've been talking about. It really does, feel like in a market where M&A activity has been low and venture dollars have been hard to find, it seems like a lot of these companies are finding, success across the board on all those fronts.
Yeah, the electrophysiology market, ablation, energy delivery is a very hot market. And I'll show you a couple of more examples of that and to prove that it really is a hot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome.
And then kind of the last one on the AFib market is the laser-based balloon. And this is the cardio-focused HeartLight laser ablation system. So in this case, there's a fiber laser within the balloon. So the energy source isn't necessarily contacting the soft tissue. And they take it a step further and have visualization through a tiny 2 French endoscope within the catheter system so they can do some visualization. And that's kind of one of the next frontiers as well that we'll talk about. Sensors, adding sensors to balloons, adding cameras to balloons, and things like that. You're going to see more and more devices mounted to the body of balloons.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I'd be curious to understand a little bit more of that clinical use case, having in essence, a scope, right? Having visualization in there, because to me, a lot of these things that they're ablating, in my mind, they're not necessarily like going to appear from observation like anything's going on, right? It's kind of that electrical circuitry of the heart, and I know they can map that in different ways, right? With some of the visualization technologies that they have. I say visualization, some of the, maybe it's radio visualization capabilities, right? But that's curious. I want to dig in more into that use case around, what the visualization is visualizing there.
Yeah, because you can imagine, we're trying to reduce the exposure of the patient and the hospital folks to radiation fluoroscopy. So they're looking at different modalities for visualization, certainly MRI, right? But the visualization through a concept like an endoscope within a catheter is a very interesting concept to a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting.
So, we talked about M&A activity and, what's hot, and certainly renal denervation balloons are hot, or renal denervation in particular. Now, Medtronic has a device. It's a spiral device that's approved right now. It's in use. It's not a balloon but the company Recor Medical has been in the news within the last year and even within the last week for their renal denervation device. So that's to treat hypertension, right? So they denervate the sympathetic nerves surrounding the renal arteries, and they use ultrasound energy through the balloon. And because there's heat generated through the ultrasound technology, they actually cool the inside of the balloon with sterile water. So they're cooling the artery and the soft tissue while they're delivering the energy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I've got to admit, kind of this denervation, right? And I understand how, ultrasonic welding, ultrasonic, what you're generating there. But I'm curious, like, what's that denervation that you're kind of referencing? What is that effectively doing to the tissue around the renal arteries?
And I'm not the right person to ask that, but they're destroying that tissue around the arteries. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep.
Really interesting.
Inflating it. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's really cool. Yeah. And it makes sense they need to cool it, because it does get hot. I mean, a lot of people are probably familiar with ultrasonic welding, right? You're just, it's getting it so hot it melts together. So
Yeah.
definitely something they'd have to watch out for there. I'm just, as we're going through this in my head, I'm just thinking about, what the quality system looks like and what's the, what's the kind of risk analysis on these things. It really is next level, like the innovation that they're doing in this space. It seems like it's moving really quickly too. It seems like there's just a ton of different modalities that are coming out and just moving at light speed.
Yeah. And this one, Recor, just a year ago was approved by the FDA. But get this, last week they announced that CMS approved a payment code specifically for ultrasound renal denervation outpatient.
Wow.
So, that's big news, right? So there's a payment code now for outpatient service.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, there's got to be give and take, pros and cons to each of these therapies. Like I'm just thinking, with cryo, you've got to have some cryogeneration and there's got to be a tank probably, right? And you're kind of pumping that type of cryo, and different things require different temperatures and you may need more or less and you have to refill that versus, some of these things that are heat, right? There's got to be an energy source, its own source of problems, right? That comes with an energy source versus, ultrasonic, right? Which you're kind of leveraging another kind of, it's not cryo, it's not necessarily thermal heat. You see what I'm saying, right? It's kind of just different ways to achieve that, ablation, energy delivery. I'd be curious to see kind of the big, in my head, I'm a visual person too, right? This big table of pros and cons where it's got cryo versus, more thermal derived energy versus ultrasound, and understanding, because I think the operating cost, right? How much does it cost me to use this, case by case by case? What's the sunk cost and capital equipment that goes along with each one of those modalities? That would be really interesting to see as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, because there's a reason that there's different modalities coming up, right? There's some unmet needs, right? That somebody's recognizing and coming up with a different solution. Yeah, so this is a hot one. I really like the story there. And what I'm really excited about is intravascular lithotripsy, IVL. And this is a technology from Shockwave Medical, where for highly calcified arteries where there's calcium within the walls of the artery, it makes it difficult for angioplasty. It makes it difficult to lay a stent. So to prep the artery, the lesion, this sonic pressure energy cracks the calcium within the walls and makes the arteries more compliant for angioplasty or for laying a stent. And this is a Shockwave Medical technology. Again, sonic energy delivery. They were recently acquired, Spencer, by J&J for $13 billion.
I saw that, and you see a lot of data on the venture market space, and any of the data that was from that quarter or even like first half of the year, what have you, it was like, here's the number for like med device or med tech, and then it would just be like asterisk 13 billion of this, right? It was Shockwave Medical, and it was kind of just like this 800-pound, gorilla, big whale, whatever you want to call it, just sitting out there. But this is super interesting. Whenever I was like looking at this, my initial thought was, I've got my yard guy told me like, hey, your soil needs to get, treated, whatever. And I ended up doing it myself, but it was basically like, we put this solution in. It took some of the calcium and minerals and kind of broke them down so that you could, have water penetrate more deeply and roots and all that stuff. So it's kind of a similar principle, right? Like the underlying structures of calcium, we've got to break those up. We've got to create a little bit more, fertile environment for this stent to come in, expand, and then really seat and hold in place, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Exactly. You just nailed it. And so it's it's fairly straightforward technology, and there are payment codes, approved for it. So, kudos to Shockwave, right? They created this market. But the downside to the Shockwave from people that I know, interventional cardiologists, the balloon is bulky. So you can't reach, the tortuous anatomy further to reach some of these, highly calcified lesions. So that's why I'm really high on the next one that I wanted to discuss, and that's Fastwave Medical. This is a company that's a startup. They have, a beautiful technology, and what they've really focused on is reducing the balloon profile and optimizing the delivery system so they can reach distally within the anatomy. And so really, really excited about Shockwave Medical. Been follow them pretty closely. Some really interesting technology. The next kind of wave, I think, in IVL.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. This is enabling you to get places you couldn't get before, right? And I feel like there's even in my head where I was thinking is like, okay, well, how can we help people get there faster, right? There's got to be some company that's probably already working on something where it's like, navigation enabled catheter guidance where doc gets access and then this thing is twirling around, constantly being pinged by a navigation system and just getting all the way to that tortuous path and saying, hey, doc, I'm here. Go ahead and hit the pulse, right? Any other ones coming down the pike, or is this the last one?
Yeah, this is the last one. What I wanted to talk a little bit about some collaboration, if you'd like.
Of course, yeah.
And this is a collaboration between two contract manufacturers in the medtech space. ProPlate, based in the Minnesota area, and Poba Medical. ProPlate, their core function is coatings, and Poba Medical is a developer of balloon technologies and catheter technologies. And so they've started to work together. And you can see here, this Metapoly technology is from ProPlate, and they can selectively add or metallize portions of a polymer balloon or a catheter. And so that's pretty tricky if you think about it. You have a soft plastic that's, again, compliant, semi-compliant, very elastomeric, and you're putting a metal over it. First of all, you can't degrade or impact the integrity of the balloon, right? So that's the first thing. And how we talked earlier about the biosense, how is that electrode mounted? We think it's more of a mechanical mount. I don't know. But this is, the metal is bonded at an atomic level to the plastic. And so there's no degradation. And because it's soft and you're inflating and deflating the balloon, you have to have a compatible material that has some ductility to it, right? It's going to work with the inflation and deflation. So this is a really cool example of that collaboration. And they were kind enough to send me a sample, and I'll share that with you. And I'll just inflate it here. You can see that electrode or the metal coated on top of this. This is a soft elastomeric balloon.
Yeah.
And so that, needs to be able to withstand that inflation and deflation, which you can see it does very nicely. That's a really cool technology and collaboration between two organizations.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, and I've seen that a number of times, and even on some smaller, kind of more simple projects. But like, you've got a great group that's doing great work with precision or micro injection molding, tiny components, this, that, and the other, and then you've got another group, right? And sometimes it's even they're selling the equipment, right? They may not be, but you still need their expertise because you're like, hey, I'm fracturing or shattering these parts when I'm trying to ultrasonically weld them, and you're looking at amplitudes and frequencies, and it takes that expertise from both sides to be able to come together and say, hey, we're trying to do something novel here. And it's pretty fun and it's pretty exciting when you see both sides really kind of step up to the plate and say, hey, we're going to help figure this out because we agree this is a novel project and it needs to get done.
It also, from a little bit different perspective, it gives you kind of a window on, private equity is huge in contract manufacturing and medtech. It enables investment and take capabilities to grow. And, if one contract manufacturer is just a plastic-based company in this space, you're really missing out a lot because there's so much integration of metals, for instance. Here's an example of the integration of plastics and a metal coating, but laser cut hypotubes and all their different types of metals being integrated with plastics. And that's what I showed you today, really. And not all contract manufacturers have that capability. They might have extrusion, molding. They can maybe form a balloon, but to integrate metals into a catheter, that's a really special organization that can do all that work. And there's very few that actually do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think all of this, right, to me is pointing towards founders and innovators. If you're at a small company, I hate when people are like, oh, well, that's the engineer's job. I don't deal with that stuff. Like, there's a point when your company becomes a certain size, everybody's going to have their divisions and their, not necessarily silos, but they own this stuff, right? It's important for people to own projects, right? But in terms of understanding the nuts and bolts, the, chemistry, the mechanics, the biomechanics of like how things are working, I think it's just super, super important for everybody on that kind of early stage team to really be sinking their teeth into the best ways and to accomplish what they need to from an engineering perspective, the new advancements in material science and contract manufacturing capabilities that are coming down the pike and what the leading companies in the space are kind of utilizing from their contract manufacturing development, all of that stuff, right? Because that's the difference between, hey, I've got an idea. Let me ask my partner, supplier, vendor if they can help do this. And then that just kind of spurs this snowball effect of ideation and innovation. But if you're just kind of throwing it on your contract manufacturer and saying, hey, help me solve this problem, right? Like, they're never going to know your product maybe as good as you, or they shouldn't know your product as good as you and shouldn't have the vision for it. So you're kind of outsourcing your own vision for innovation to them. And that's probably never a good idea.
Right. And so just to kind of wrap things up on the innovations related to balloons, there's a couple things I see coming down the road. that are being developed as well. And that's, the integration of sensors on balloons. I talked a little bit about that, right? So you can look at contact force, pressure, temperature, maybe flow, the integration of cameras. Cameras are getting so tiny now, they're, endoscopes, and we'll start to see the integration of cameras within the body of a balloon or the distal end of a catheter, a balloon-based catheter. And then also there's some work being done. We're all familiar with radiopacity, adding radiopaque fillers to catheters and tubing so you can see under fluoroscopy. There's some work being done for radiopaque balloons so that you can see the properties of the balloon as you're inflating and deflating. So a lot of really interesting specialty balloon-based technologies coming up.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. So if you're an early stage innovator and you think you've got some balloon-based technology, right, and you're really getting started, what are some common mistakes that you see young companies make when they're kind of starting that process? I'll just give a real quick personal one. I see a lot of companies just like rush to get this kind of full-scale MVP device made, and I am much more in the hack and harvest camp where you're like, hey, let's see if we can, get some stuff, cut it open, glue it together, make it work, see what we need, because I feel like it's such an application, nothing static, right? It's balloons, things are moving, they're flexing, they're bending, they're inflating. So that's something I think specifically on my side, I see just like, hey, let's start small, hack and harvest, let's get some off-the-shelf stuff and just blow it up, glue it, see if it works. But what are some, common mistakes that you've seen the early stage companies make and recommendations to help them avoid those?
Yeah, I think, a lot of work is done early stage on prototyping and iteration like you talked about and developing these, first generation devices. But there's not enough design for manufacturability built into the early process to say, hey, look, what if we scale this design? Can we manufacture it at scale at a certain price point that the market will bear? So, not doing that DFM up front is a killer, right? You might have a great design, but if it's not manufacturable, you're screwed, right? That's one of the leading issues that I see, and choosing the right partner to do that, really. And when choosing that partner, sometimes the device designers don't want to share enough about the therapy. And so they need to know that information up front. They need to know all the information. You sign all these NDAs, share the data, share the therapy. What are the ups and downs or pros and cons of the certain designs for the therapy? They need to know that.
Yeah, totally agree. And this goes back to a conversation I had with Sam Wagner from Medical Murray, that just be transparent with your manufacturing partner about your cost of goods targets, right? Because exactly what you said, if you're trying to kind of hide the ball there, and you're not being as disclosing as much about the user needs and kind of clinical requirements and the price points and things like that, no one benefits from that. Yeah, we can make 1,000 of these, but making 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 are going to be the same price, and it's all too high, right? It's not going to be supported by the sales price we can fetch in the market. And I definitely think, acquirers do care about cost of goods, right? They care about that manufacturability. And not to say if your cost of goods are a little bit higher, they're never going to acquire you, right? But I think it's about what you said about the scalability of the design, right? They may not expect you to put $50 million into, some automated manufacturing process to get it down as low as possible, but they need to know that they can if they want to, right? Or they need to know that there is a path to getting those cost of goods down, right? Whether it's the number of components, sometimes there's just no way to get around this design has to be made this way, and it has this many pieces of bonding and this many different materials, and the bill of materials looks like a CVS receipt, super long, all that jazz.
Yeah.
But kind of follow-on question to that, specifically in the RFQ process, I mean, this is something that I think, I focus on this a lot just because I think it is a very difficult process right now. Sometimes founders are not sure what they're looking for. It's trying to find a needle in a haystack. Certain contract manufacturers, the websites, it's almost like two people speaking different languages that are trying to kind of create a partnership here. But any high level recommendations for innovators starting or going through that RFQ process with contract manufacturers?
Yeah, I think to kind of reiterate what we talked about, that transparency, right? And sometimes, you might want to know upfront, what are the volumes for this program, right? Because that'll help you understand what kind of resources you bring to bear. And almost all the time, when somebody gives you those volumes, they're never right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you need to have some, honest transparency. If you don't know, you don't know. But that's an important piece of the puzzle here, right?
Yeah.
It goes along with that DFM.
I totally agree. Don't try to be too cute on the timeline as well. These aren't investors, you know what I mean? Just be completely honest. Be this is our timeline, or if it's something as fundraising dependent and you're going through a fundraising route, just tell them that. They understand, right? They're running businesses. And you can say, we'd like to get started here. It's fundraising dependent. As soon as we raise money, this would start the clock, and here's the rest of the timeline. They will appreciate that so much more than them trying to build capacity into their workflow that you just rug pull on because you didn't really tell them that, right? It was dependent on something else. else. So another question, I feel like your content, the stuff you put out on LinkedIn and the podcast and stuff, it's highly technical and it's very specific and it's really targeted at a specific audience. But I love seeing it, even if it's a little bit like some of it, you guys are wicked smart. And I'm like, all right, I understood 85% of that, right? But it's clearly working because you're developing this audience. There's a lot of people that are doing this and interested in the space. So the main question here is just that decision to lean into that really niche technical content and grow that audience. I just want to understand the thought process that you went through and kind of what was the catalyst for you leaning into that type of content.
Yeah, that's a good question because I think over the years, that's how I've always been. And there's been pushback from people, especially like in the marketing folks that maybe don't understand the technology. It's like, hey, you're being way too technical here. So I've been accused of that, and that's fine. I wear it. That's a badge of honor. But I think, this is a very technical market. Just look what we went through. It's very technical, and it's way more technical than I even presented when you get down to the nuts and bolts, right? So that's really the target audience that I'm trying to attract, is those people that really want those nuggets of information, because there's high level talking points all over the place and
Yes.
people have seen it. They want the real good information, the nuggets. And that's what I try to feed to the audience.
Well, I mean, it's working, and keep doing it. Honestly, there's that saying, if you try to be something to everybody, you're going to be, nothing to anybody, right? Like, it's so true. I love seeing, and LinkedIn has just kind of grown as this like medium to go and really find content that you trust, right? And so I love seeing surgeons posting, x-rays, right? Or a screenshot from a navigation portion of a procedure, right? All of that stuff, I love seeing it. I love seeing technical presentations, technical discussions from people like you, just because that's what people want to see, right? Like, people, especially in the medtech industry, like, things are getting increasingly niche. And if you are trying to build trust with an audience like you want to be an expert, right? You don't become an expert by saying, look at this new exterior of our facility that we just, like, no one really wants to hear about that, right? Like, the
cares.
whole like, bland self-promotion, this, that, and the other. Like, people want to know stuff that matters, stuff that's interesting, stuff that excites them. And so I just want to say, kudos to you for really leaning into that type of content, because I think if more people did that, right, there'd be way less noise. And then people can say, yeah, these are the things I'm passionate about. Let me dig into those. But I've got another question. Like, all of this stuff in the cardiac market, like, it's been kind of the shining light in medtech in my view, like, for better or for worse, because I'm not in the cardiac space much. Mm-hmm. But I'm just curious, like, where are you seeing this cardiac market, kind of interventional energy delivery? Where are you seeing that market go? Kind of a forecast for that. I'm just curious if you're kind of like, sky's the limit right now. It's just not slowing down. If there's anything going on with, like, surgery center, outpatient moving, service lines within hospitals, like, anything you see affecting that market over the next couple of years.
Yeah, a couple things. And I talked about IVL, right? Lithotripsy. That's kind of an outpatient technology. And that is, remember we talked about reaching distally more lesions, right? So the next frontier there is to go peripheral, below the knee, for instance. Yeah, that's the next frontier for that. And certainly we didn't talk about structural heart because it's a different therapy, but that's a very high growth market. And one of my medical processing panels a couple weeks ago, and Dan Kasperzik of POBA, I talked a little bit about POBA today. I'm going to change the subject a little bit, but he said neurovascular is where cardiovascular was 20 years ago. So he believes there's a huge opportunity in neurovascular.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I feel like the stuff I saw today really was Star Wars type futuristic technology, but that's interesting. So if you're an innovator out there and you're listening, you heard it from Steve first, be thinking about that neurovascular stuff that you can lean into. Steve, I think, I don't have any more questions. This has been like incredibly enlightening for me. Is there anything, parting thoughts of wisdom, other topics that you want to hit on before we wrap up the pod?
No, I just want to reiterate, collaboration, that collaboration up front, sharing information for design for manufacturability and innovating together will really create tremendous opportunities.
Yeah. And I know I said I was just going to wrap it, but that made me think of something. You've been through the RFQ process with a lot of things. If you're doing a software project, and some people probably do this too in medtech, software or some different product development companies, they'll have, a product requirements definition, PRD document, right? And I think I've gone through the RFQ process with a lot of medtech products, and I rarely get asked about something like that, right? They'll say, do you have your BOM? Do you have your CAD files? Do you have your prints? And sometimes you say, do you have a list of user needs or whatever? But I think the more that you can, kind of codify, define, and distribute to your partners those types of requirements and definitions in whatever form, right, that you can get it to them, it helps them so much. You know what I mean? Even if it's, any way that you can get it to them. But it's just funny. I feel like that product requirements definition document, that PRD framework, have you seen it be used in medtech? I've seen it in software. I've seen it in other consumer electronics, but not as much in medtech.
Not as much as it should be. Something also to kind of change it. We talked about, startups, right? And choosing a contract manufacturer. Something to keep in mind that I've seen over the last couple of years is, the big contract manufacturers during COVID and during supply chain, they really had to buckle in and really focus on their top 15 customers. So if you were a startup with one of those big contract manufacturers, you probably weren't that happy, right? And it's likely that you transferred the business to a smaller to mid-size contract manufacturer. We saw a lot of that. So it's something to keep in mind if you're a startup company, the contract manufacturer that you choose. Of course, you always want to dual source if you can to mitigate your risk, but you're probably, if you're a smaller startup, better suited to work with a mid-size to small contract manufacturer. You'll get more attention.
I totally agree. And this is part of my going through the RFQ process, part of the big headache that I feel like it happens because you've got a lot of these big groups, right? There's been a lot of, acquisitions and inorganic growth of these groups that are rolling up all these different facilities. All of them probably are contracted with a marketing and a brand agency. So they're spending money on Google AdWords. So their SEO is top notch. But I think the vast majority of contract manufacturers are less than 50 employees and they're smaller shops, right? They may be a 20,000 square foot facility, 20 employees, something like that. And they may be the absolute perfect partner for you if you're a startup, but it is just so much harder to find them because all you're seeing is the Globo Corp 1, Globo Corp 2 contract manufacturers. So it really is tough. And people talk about capabilities a lot. Sure, right? You've got to have a capabilities match, but do they understand what they're going to have to do for me as a startup? Can we have a good relationship when it comes to prototyping and lead times, payment terms? Go down the list. It really is it's hard these days for startups to find the right people because they're getting kind of the ways they have to find them. They're getting force-fed the biggest corporations in the biz, right?
Yep, exactly.
Well, Steve, I can't thank you enough. This has been awesome. Every time we do one of these podcasts, I learned something new. I will say this from a technical perspective, especially about energy delivery with balloons. I learned so much today. So I really appreciate you being on the pod. If anybody wants to get in contact with Steve, we'll put his LinkedIn in the show notes as well as some other links, some of the things he was referencing. Thank you for listening to the pod. Steve, thank you for being on for this episode and hope to have you back sometime in the future.
All right. Sounds like a plan, Spencer. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.